Welcome to the fourth episode of the Hello World podcast. My name is Sean Wildermuth and I'm your host. The Hello World podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got into this business. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. Today I'm excited to welcome Brian Noyes. He's a software architect, the CTO of Soliance at Soliance.net, a Microsoft Regional Director, a Microsoft MVP, and a Pluralsight author. Brian specializes in building rich client applications with XAML and HTML5, as well as the services that back them with web APIs and WCF services. Brian has authored a number of books, including The Developer's Guide to Microsoft Prism 4, Smart Client Deployment with Click Once, and Data Binding with Windows Forms 2.0. He speaks at conferences worldwide, including Microsoft TechEd, VS Live, Dev Intersection, and others. You can contact Brian on Twitter using @BrianNoyes, Noyes, or through his blog at briannoyes.net. So let's listen in and see what Brian has to say about how he got started. Well, today I'd like to welcome Brian Noyes to the Hello World podcast. I've known Brian for I don't know how many years now. We sort of played tag on an old project years ago and then have been running into each other at conferences ever since. How are you doing, Brian?
I'm doing great.
So as you know, this podcast is all about, how you got started. And when we talked, you had told me that you had this really interesting story of how you actually got started. Most of the other folks we've talked to, talk about their first computer when they were 11 and then sneaking into the computer lab and all that. So I'm interested in how your story starts.
Sure. I've had that conversation many times at conferences with people, and it does seem like there's, sort of a prototypical mold for a lot of programmers, but I don't think I quite fit that. I kind of was a late bloomer in terms of, being a professional software developer and having this be my entire focus. I had no real early exposure to computers at a young age. I think the first real exposure I had was in college. I vaguely remember that my high school had a computer club of some sort, but I actually grew up as a surfer bum in Southern California in Carlsbad.
Oh, wow.
So I was all about the beach and surfing and, wasn't going to hang out with those geeks.
Little did you know.
Yeah, exactly. So, not much influence at an early age there. In college, I went to the U.S. Naval Academy and we did some computer stuff there. They had mainframes and they had some old style, green screen graphics terminals for the engineering curriculum I was in, which was aerospace. And then I remember writing my thesis. We had to write a thesis for a graduation project and did that on an old Mac II.
Oh, wow.
That was I take it back. There was one other exposure. There was they had a variant of calculus that they called computer calculus. So we would write little programs, mathematical programs in BASIC on the mainframe to, do various calculations and stuff. And I totally enjoyed that. And definitely, I think I didn't recognize it at the time, but, I had a passion for it. But my career was taking me elsewhere at that point. Being at the Naval Academy, I was headed off after I graduated, went and flew jets and flew F-14 Tomcats.
Did you start, were you in a military family or how'd you end up in the Naval Academy?
I was, but it wasn't really forced on me.
Oh, sure.
Should I wait for the plane there? I can see you suffer the same fate I do with my Pluralsight recordings.
I do. So I record it between 1 and 4 a.m.
Wait, that was on my end, wasn't it?
It was.
I've got headphones on, so.
It actually works out because you're talking about flying a Tomcat. Yeah. So I know it doesn't sound like a Tomcat to you, but to our audience it will.
Anyway, so so I was from a military family. My dad was a career Marine Corps officer, but he was pretty good about not pushing me into the military. He pretty much said, there's these service academies you might want to look into, but, whatever you want to do. But once I started looking into, going to school and he couldn't afford to just send me anywhere, it was pretty much up to me to, find my own way to college. they started looking pretty attractive there. So I ended up going to the Naval Academy.
And did you go into the Naval Academy knowing you wanted to fly?
Interesting thing is I didn't even know that was an option when I first signed up. It was only after I was deep into the application process. I assumed that it meant I would end up driving ships.
Oh, sure. It being the Naval Academy. Yeah,
exactly. But once I got into it and, found out there's this whole naval aviation thing, definitely, started aiming for that and was certainly aiming for that throughout my time at the Naval Academy. You have to go through a service selection process at the end of your senior year, and it's all based on your grades and your performance overall and various rankings and stuff. So, I was always busting my ass there so that I could have good enough grades to fly.
Wow. And when you talk about flying, did you say F-14 Tomcats? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, most people can, somewhat identify that plane because it's the ones that were in Top Gun.
Yeah. And did when you flew, was it primarily, on ships or?
Yeah. So I started, there's a whole training pipeline you go through. So you start off and you go down to Pensacola, Florida, and you start out in fixed wing prop planes and learn the basics of flying there. And then you do a further selection. So first you pick whether you're going to fly, drive ships, become a Marine or whatever.
Sure.
Out of the Naval Academy. And then once you get into flight school, it's competitive in terms of what plane you end up in. And so there's a separate pipeline for jets and prop planes and helicopters. So I competed to get jets. And then once you're in jets, it's competitive in terms of, are you going to end up in bombers or fighters and the various platforms there?
Sure.
So ultimately I ended up exactly where I wanted to be there. At the time, the fighter track was the premier choice. And
sure.
Just to clarify, people always say, so you were a pilot. I wasn't a pilot. I was a naval flight officer. I was a backseater, a goose type of person.
Oh, sure.
And so that limited some of the choices there, like helicopters only were for pilots.
Oh, sure. And so what does the guy in the back do for those of us, including me, who has no idea? Sure. I'm assuming the stick's in the front. And so after that, I'm kind of lost. Yeah.
So it depends on the plane, depending on the mission of the aircraft. But for the Tomcat, the RIO, as it was called, Radar Intercept Officer in the back, basically several roles. One was to back up the pilot in terms of flying the plane. So we didn't have a stick in the back. The only physical mechanism we had to control the flight of the plane was the ejection handle.
Oh, sure.
But we could yell and scream and back them up basically on the instruments and kind of verbally help them fly in intense times, such as landing at the carrier.
Sure.
It's definitely a team effort there. But, in terms of the overall mission of the plane, we were basically responsible for the weapon system as a whole.
Okay.
So all of the sort of long range part of the mission of detecting other planes via radar, shooting the long range weapons, that kind of stuff was all the backseater's responsibility.
Interesting.
And then it was the pilot's responsibility if you were in air combat for the close-in weapons. So the gun and the Sidewinder, the infrared close-range missile, would be the pilot's responsibility there. So it was kind of a sharing of responsibilities there.
So yours was more tactical, whereas the pilot deals with more of the, I hate to say dogfight, but that's kind of what the picture I have in my head is. When they're close up, it's the pilot's responsibility, but otherwise it's yours.
Yeah, pretty much. But even in the, close-in dogfighting arena, it was definitely a team effort that,
sure.
If anyone's watched Top Gun, they showed the backseater is generally turned around looking at your six, basically. So
sure.
It was my responsibility to make sure someone wasn't jumping us while the pilot was jumping someone else.
Yeah. And was all that computerized back then?
No, it was all very, the Tomcat was a pretty primitive plane compared to the stuff we've got these days.
Sure.
It was not fly-by-wire, so it was hydromechanical in terms of the flight controls and stuff.
Yep.
And the radar system, the weapon system and stuff was all very electronic circuit, lots of big, chunky electronic boxes with, basically embedded systems for a given thing. The mission computer of sorts probably is, 1/1000th of the capability of our cell phones and things like that.
Yeah, as that goes. Yeah. And how long did you do that?
I did that. So I got my wings in 88, after you get your wings, then you go and train on your specific platform. So from 88 to 90, I was learning to fly the F-14 and its systems. And then I did an operational tour from 90 to 92. And that's the point where you asked about carriers. So that's the point where we went out on carriers. So I was on the USS Carl Vinson and deployed to the Pacific. And this was, we called it the last of the great pleasure cruises, because this was, timing wise, we basically deployed. And it was the day we returned from deployment, literally, that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait.
Oh, wow.
So it was a very peaceful time up until that return day. And so we spent most of our time at sea just training, and spent probably almost as much time in foreign ports as we did actually at sea.
Wow.
And pretty much every cruise since then, they haul their ass over to the Gulf and they stay there for the full deployment.
Sure. And you left before all that happened?
Yeah. So we came back from that deployment, and our squadron was actually scheduled to get the first of the next version of the F-14, the F-14Ds. And so we were on a long training pipeline for that. And I actually rotated out of the squadron before they deployed again.
And how long were you in the Navy total?
I was on active duty for 13 years. Wow. So I went off active duty in 2000 and stayed in the reserves and retired from the reserves in 2008.
Wow. So
I'm actually a retired Navy commander, reserves.
Wow. And that's why you usually speak at conferences, right? You don't really talk about the, your time in the Navy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just a 100% reuse of my first career.
And so, how did that transition into software development?
Basically, back in my very first squadron there, I think the point where things really started taking off for me as far as computers go is that I had a buddy in the squadron. One of the pilots was a computer science major and was a total geek. And so he got me interested. The natural path of evolution was games, of course.
Sure.
So, first he introduced me to a bunch of really cool computer games, and I got hooked on those. And then I, just kind of found that I was interested in computers in general, and started becoming a power user. And then, at that point, I sort of remembered that I sort of knew how to program BASIC at one point in college. And I was like, well, I should, learn to program again. And so I started I started with some DBase stuff. I found some little side projects
nice.
And did some DBase 3. And then at that point, I was like, okay, I like doing this. I want to learn more about it. And I kind of started looking around at the landscape. And that was right about the point where C++ and object orientation was taking off. And I had the questionable sense to pick that as my learning language. So I basically dove headlong into C++ development at that point. But it was, entirely a hobby, part-time, in my free time kind of thing for the first 5 years at least.
And there's, it's nothing like an eater of free time, like learning pointers in C++.
Yeah, exactly. But, while I was still in the Navy, because I was, still in till 2000.
Right.
I kind of took a technical track within the Navy. After my first operational flying tour there, I went into a program that was called the Test Pilot School Co-op program. So in my operational tour, I did go to Top Gun, got to experience all that. And actually that's somewhat relevant to my current career, because a big part of the Top Gun curriculum was actually, they called it train the trainer, which is a term we're all familiar with.
Yeah, we are.
And so the whole idea of Top Gun, really beyond the Hollywood hype, is that you learn all the advanced tactics and you learn how to do that so that you can go back and become the training officer for your squadron.
I see. So
I was actually the Rio training officer for my squadron after Top Gun. And then, that kind of, it obviously totally different domain in terms of the knowledge, but certainly training techniques and presentation techniques and things like that were things I was definitely able to carry forward.
Sure, the whole figuring out how to tell the story to get people to grasp it, but also be interested in it and not lose them. All that translates, whether you're teaching 4-year-olds, Navy pilots, or software developers.
Exactly. And then, so after that, I went to this Test Pilot School Co-op program, which was basically, I went to grad school first. I went to Navy postgraduate school and got a master's degree in aerospace engineering. And then I went to test pilot school after that. And test pilot school was basically teaching you to be a test pilot, or in my case, a test naval flight officer. And basically the division of the curriculum there was that the naval flight officers focused on mission system tests. So things like the mission computers, navigation systems, weapon systems, that kind of stuff. So I basically went through that training curriculum, ended up at Point Mugu for a test tour. You always do a 3-year test tour after that. So you're basically a flight test air crew, and you manage the projects that are in development. So they're, at that point, I basically got into doing technical project management. And because it was all systems tests, it was really mostly software. A lot of it was embedded software in the avionics. But I also managed a project that was basically a ground support program. It was a mission planning system for tactical aviation.
And was most of this testing on the ground?
Well, the flight test was all airborne, so we would go flying and fly some of it was mission computers, some was weapons, and we'd have all kinds of telemetry on the plane that would kind of beam, the captured data, the monitoring data, if you will, would be getting beamed down to the ground real time. And then they do post-mission analysis of that. And plus we would be as test air crew, you can think of it in terms of making analogies to doing user acceptance testing. So we were basically, and it really literally was that in terms of, at that point, we were flying the F-14Ds. They had a mission computer, which had a single display in the plane there, but it had a bunch of menus. It had, graphical displays of information. And so we were really user acceptance testing the user interface of the mission computer software for the projects we were working on.
Because the people on the plane, they can't waste time, digging through menus to find what they need to do. I mean, this is very time critical.
Oh yeah. And it's funny though, flashing back to some of that stuff, because that's exactly the kind of stuff we would find is that, they would add some new feature. The one thing that you had to have, immediate access to and would use all the time would be buried 6-7 menus deep. And then, we'd come back and be, seriously? So
that's how we now eject from, a down plane.
Yeah, exactly.
That's funny. And so, when you say project management, was it, managing projects to do this testing, or was there any actual software development while you were still in the Navy?
Officially, there was no software development in that pretty much the Navy, at that time at least, they contracted all that stuff out. The services are a little different. That the Air Force, for example, does have programmers. And this may have changed since I got out. But at the time, the Air Force, actually had a specialty that was a programmer. And they had IT guys and stuff like that. The Navy generally contracted all that kind of stuff out. So I was basically managing as I was the stakeholder, if you will, the government representative for the project, managing a team of contractors that were doing the actual coding. But on some of those, like that ground mission planning system I talked about, I found some places where I was like, God, we really need this feature. And they're like, yeah, but we don't have budget for it. And I was like, well, fine, I'll just write it myself. Yeah. So I did a little bit of that. And on one of the projects I was working on, the actual flight test stuff, we had, as I said, we were putting basically one of the projects I was working on was integrating GPS into the plane for navigation. Right. So obviously there was a whole bunch of new displays and menus and controls within the aircraft. We had these, keypad kind of inputs and stuff, and they had no. Basically, the software engineers would come up with an idea. They'd go off, they'd write it, they'd get it all built, they'd install it in the plane, we'd go fly with it, and we'd punch our way around through the menus and try to figure out how it works and whether it worked correctly. And so often we'd come back from those with examples like the one I said before, where it's like, yeah, but this one thing that I need all the time, it's 6 menus deep. Can't you put it up here? And so we try to, sketch things out for them and try to describe to them the way we thought it should be. And I just kind of got sick of that process. So as a little side project, I built a whole controls and displays simulator using DirectX.
Oh, nice.
And basically simulated the multifunction display that we had in the plane. I simulated all the new navigation functionality that we were incorporating. And we, initially used it as a feedback tool to basically, I'd go program it up. The pilots and stuff would sit down after a test mission. We'd kind of talk in our lingo about, what we thought it should do. I'd go program it up and just give it to the engineers and say, here, make it do this.
Make it look like this. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we ended up using that as a training tool too. And in advanced prototyping, like I said, we would basically, put it in there as a prototype so that the engineers could really, see interactively what we were talking about. And then we handed that over to the operational guys so that they could use it for training before they went flying.
Nice. So, don't have to do that big step of deploying it to the plane before
Exactly.
you got to look at it.
Yeah, because typical government budgets thing, the plan was put all this new avionics in the plane, that keeps you from crashing into the ground, and just send them flying and let them figure it out.
So working with the contractor team, that experience had to affect how you deal, with teams of developers now.
Yeah, it definitely does, because I had that early experience of being more on the, product owner side of things.
Sure.
And being responsible for the schedule and budget and all the higher level program management types of responsibilities, while still, because of the stuff I was doing on the side, I could speak the lingo and really did understand. I hadn't, at that point, I had never been a full-time developer.
Sure.
So I didn't really have the full perspective of what that meant, and, how hard it can be sometimes, and what the real frustrations, and how those, pointy-haired bosses that I was one at the time, said, just get it done on this timeline and, make it happen kind of crap.
Yeah.
So, I'm sure I was hated by the developers at certain points, just like I've hated certain bosses. But at least I had some technical chops that a lot of the other people didn't have, because they, had never touched software in their life.
Sure. You knew what ankle brackets look like. Curly braces look like. So, that's some cred. So how did that mature into like your first job as an actual full-time developer?
Well, it just kept kind of accelerating for me while I was in the Navy, that, more and more I was interested in the software and less in what I was doing in my Navy career.
Sure.
And part of it was just my nature is to be technical. And the normal progression of a Navy career is you either stick to the operational route, which I had already departed from, and you constantly try to just do the right things to end up in a command type of tour.
Sure.
Where you're in command of a squadron or a ship or whatever. That's the main operational track. I was off that after my first operational tour, because I took this, route via the test pilot school stuff. Mm-hmm. Once you're in the technical track, then there is a predetermined path that thou shalt follow, which is that you build to program management, higher and higher levels of that, bigger programs and, larger budgets type of thing.
Yeah.
And the more senior you become, the less technical you can be. Obviously, you become all about the schedule and the budget type of stuff instead of the technical implementation. So
which is the same with development, software
absolutely.
Development.
Yeah, it's very true. So there was a natural point of separation for me there, that the test tour was right up my alley, because I could stay, down in the weeds enough to be very technical. And then I did one follow-on tour, basically building satellites, that was very technical. But then my next tour, based on getting promoted to commander, it meant I would have to go off to what's called NAVAIR. It's the Naval Air Systems Command, that's in charge of all the development projects for the Navy for aviation. And I'd have to be a program manager. And that was the point where I said, nah, I'm going to separate at this point.
Yeah.
And so I had built up enough, knowledge and credibility and stuff with the stuff I had done to that point, that I was able to step out and get a advanced developer job as I left the Navy there, and started out with a full-time job with a defense contractor, where I could leverage some of my contacts with the Navy. Sure.
And domain knowledge, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. Well, not so much, actually. It was actually a contractor that was building SIGINT systems for the Marine Corps. And I didn't have that much knowledge in that arena, but...
Sure, but you understood the language of the military. I mean, there's a rhythm to certain kinds of government contracts that some people are just
Yes,
they
absolutely.
understand, and other people like me just don't. What do you mean it takes 2 years to get paid?
Yes, exactly. It's a very slow rhythm, but there's a rhythm.
And you were doing C++?
So I was pretty much entirely C++ the whole time I was doing stuff on my own. When I got out of the Navy and joined that company, it was mostly C++, a little bit of classic ASP web development.
Sure. And was this like in the ATL C++ days, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was, ATL and MFC types of stuff.
Yeah, well, let's not talk about MFC, but ATL, yeah. Having lived through those, the 4 people that are listening to this that remember MFC.
And
but
actually, I take it back. In that job, I also got pulled into my first Java project.
Oh, nice.
And also some Visual Basic stuff.
Yeah, you sure you want it to be on record you do Visual Basic? Because, I'm sure you'll get some job offers.
Yeah. I do it when I have to.
Yeah, I understand. Been there. So, and that was building these systems for the Marines, but these were, more typically, straight ahead data entry sort of positions that we all know and love.
No. So you mean the programming job I had?
Yeah.
No. This was I somehow managed to talk them into. Just because of all the stuff I had done on the side and the role I was in the Navy and my various degrees and yada, yada, I talked my way into what was called an advanced developer position. So it was more like an architect type of job.
Nice.
So I was more of a, technical team lead. And actually, shortly after I joined the company, when I first hired on, it was interesting because I knew based on all this, program project management stuff in the Navy, that they would want to put me into that kind of role.
Sure.
And I was specifically leaving the Navy to try to,
avoid it,
effectively switch careers back into a programmer role. And so I told them, in the hiring process, don't do that or I will leave. And sure enough, about a year and a half later, they promoted me. Of course, no increase in pay, but in title, they promoted me to be the development manager for the company. And it wasn't long after that I left because I got, too busy managing and couldn't build things anymore.
Yeah.
But that was the point where I went independent and have been independent consulting ever since.
Did you have any mentors in software development that sort of impacted how you do work and how you even work with customers now that you're independent?
Well, there were definitely some, mentors of sorts, more people who motivated me a lot in the early days.
Sure.
As I was making that transition, while I was still in the Navy, I started writing articles and became a contributing editor for Fawcett. So
nice.
This was back in the Visual C++ Developers Journal was the first magazine there that I started writing articles for. And at the time, here I was this, naval officer who was doing this as a hobby basically, and, started writing these things. And then they made me a contributing editor. I started technical reviews of other authors' articles. And so I was doing the technical review for guys like Yuval Lowy. That's how Yuval and I first met.
Oh, nice.
Dino Esposito, folks like that, so at the time, these were the real stuff. I was just this amateur trying to break into this arena, but here I am technical reviewing their content, which seemed a little strange at the time. But now that I've, been doing that a lot longer, I understand it. A lot of it's just about getting a second set of eyes and making sure it's readable and understandable to someone who is less qualified.
Yeah. And compiles. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But so there were, folks like that. And I went to some conferences back in the late 90s there where folks like Richard Grimes was, a famous guy at the time in terms of ATL and COM. Jeff Procyse I met back then and got to be friends with. So these guys that, they were giants to me in terms of software at the time. Now they're, colleagues and buddies in the industry, but they definitely influenced me in terms of who I wanted to become and the kind of role I wanted to have in the industry.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And so what are you doing these days? I know you're doing Pluralsight recording, but I don't know what else you're up to.
Yeah, so I co-founded a company with Michelle Laruba-Sumonte and Zoiner Tejada at the end of last year called Alliance. It's kind of a contraction of Solution Alliance.
Nice.
But in general, we do big projects. So we're doing end-to-end development projects for customers that, don't have enough of a staff to do it all themselves. But we also do a lot of just expert level consulting where we go in for a given technology that one of us specializes in, helping out an existing development team to get up to speed on that, to implement certain requirements that they're not capable of, and that kind of thing.
Nice. So you go all the way from inception and idea through delivery.
Yeah.
That's nice. And being able to see, as a consultant, sometimes it's hard to walk away knowing that, someone else is taking over some of the ideas.
And I really enjoy being, as my early involvement kind of indicates, I like being deeply involved with the code. And so I really wanted to, set up a situation there where we could be more part of the project end to end, whether we did all the work ourselves as a company or whether we just facilitated the work all along the way. That's a big part of our focus at Solution at Alliance is getting the whole project built.
And this is going to allow you to shepherd it from, inception through delivery, which I'm sure, from your experience sounds like a lot of what, you love about the work.
Absolutely.
Well, it's been great having you on. It's a very interesting story about how you got started, and I'm sure it's a little different than many of our listeners. I really